Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Love Will podcast. My name is Marlen, and you can notice about now that Anna is not here with us for this episode. Unfortunately, she was out of town, but we already had plans to talk with our guest today. So she is definitely very sad that she missed out on this one. Today we have a super special guest, a very dear friend now to me, Jess. Welcome to the Love Will podcast. Jess and I met last year, and yes, last year at
Yeah.
a women's conference in New York, and actually through Latinas Loving Jesus. And as for those of you who listened to Yvette's story that we shared a couple weeks ago, um, yes, she was a part of that group of friends that were there together, and we got to meet, and I got to hear some of her story. And I cannot wait for you all to hear what she has to share. Just the wonderful work that she does right where she's at. So, Jess, welcome. Can you tell us a
Hi.
little bit more about who you are, what you do? Yeah, tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, I'd love to. It's so great to see you again, even if it's just
Yes.
virtually. But yes, it was amazing to connect with you. I'm Jess Galván, and I am a writer currently for a large Christian humanitarian organization. But before that, I was a stay-at-home mom, and I was freelancing as a writer and editor in publishing. And I am a self-proclaimed story advocate, and I will just I guess the best way to explain that would be I truly believe in the power of storytelling and how
Mm,
sharing your human experience can truly change the world. So I love that you're doing this. Podcast is one of those great ways of sharing your stories. So
mm.
um, I truly believe in the power of that. And I am a wife of 11 years. I am a mom of three amazing, goofy kiddos. Let's see. I'm an extrovert. I'm an Enneagram 7. I consider myself
Let's
a
go.
creative person, and I love deep conversation that
Mm,
brings people together. And I have a really big heart for BIPOC community and us like sharing our stories. So I'm also part of this Chasing Justice community. I love
mm.
them and the work that they do too. And let's see. And I'm from Chicago, but I currently am living outside of Houston in Texas. So that's a little bit
Wonderful.
about me, I guess.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much for sharing. I didn't even know a couple of those things, and I'm like, that is wonderful. I
Yeah.
even get to learn more about you and your story. And it's so beautiful that you touched on like being an advocate about like for people's stories because that is
Mhm.
literally our heartbeat here at Level Podcast is to share the stories, like the firsthand experiences from people,
Mhm.
especially regarding a very hot topic that as immigration, but we wanted to center it back to people. And I mean, I'm a broken record at this point that I just keep saying that, but it's just true, because it's
You
easy to forget. It's easy to
Yeah.
forget to
Yeah.
because it's such a political issue that we forget that there are real people behind
Mhm.
these stories and how it is also an extension. And that's why we've loved to bring all the different perspectives from first-hand experiences as from immigrants and refugees, but also how it extends to second generation and third generation and
Mhm.
fourth generation, and how that evolves and changes, but yet how it deeply impacts the day-to-day lives of many people. So as we dive
Absolutely.
into your story, um, can you share with us what is your cultural background, and can you tell
Yeah.
us a little bit of what life looked like growing up?
Yeah. So I am a 2.5 generation Mexican American. And I say 2.5 because
Yep.
my mother immigrated here when she was 18 years old in the 80s. And my paternal grandparents immigrated from Mexico when they were young. So I'm like second generation on my mom's
Yep.
side and third generation on my dad, which that alone brought, a really interesting dynamic in my life. But
Yeah.
yes, my family is from Mexico. And just growing up, what that looked like was So, it was like a mesh of the 2 cultures, right?
Mm,
And actually, as I'm, like, speaking now, it's kind of also a mesh of that different generational gap of having
mm,
one side of the family in a different part of of our story, and then the other side of the family experiencing that, more immediate immigrant story, through my
mm,
mom. But yeah, so my mom was a stay-at-home mom, and, she came from Mexico when she was really young, when she met my dad, and they got married and started their life here. And, yeah, I grew up speaking Spanish at home since my mom did not know the language. And so, English, I didn't learn until I was thrown into the school system and
yeah,
figured that out on my own. And,
mm,
because my mom was so young when she moved here, we would visit family in Mexico very often. We were going constantly all the time to see her side of the family, like my grandmother that's over there, my aunts and my uncles and my cousins. So
mm,
I just remember a lot. This was back in the 80s and early
yeah,
90s when you could like fly very frequently. And often my mom would send my older sister and I by ourselves on a plane to go visit our family in
yeah,
Mexico. And so it was definitely kind of this like teeter totter of going between these 2 cultures, one
mm,
being America and then one in Mexico. So, but they were deep, those roots that my mom were planting within us ran really deep as a little baby. I mean, I was baptized. We grew up Catholic, so I was
mm.
baptized in the like cathedral in the Zócalo in Mexico, and every time I go there, I just
Wow.
remember like these
Mm,
huge family gatherings that we'd
mhm,
have, and
mhm.
just the rich family life that we had. And I didn't know otherwise. I didn't know that that was not everyone's experience. That just was kind of how I grew up, and I thought that everyone was, I had that experience of going back and forth and seeing family in other countries and stuff like that. So yeah, that's how I kind of grew up with my mom, or the experience through my mom as an immigrant, and then with my dad, all of his family, my grandparents, my aunts and my uncles, his brothers and sisters, they were already here, had been here for a generation. So we also then had deep family roots here in Chicago, um,
Mm,
and just also doing the family things there, and just seeing the difference of what kind of like what one generation what that does, and going through that experience, and even
mm, mm.
having cousins that that we were like the same age and
Yeah,
didn't speak Spanish and didn't
yeah, yeah, yeah. Mhm,
also have like didn't go back to visit their family in
mm.
Mexico, but then I would be gone like in the summers in Mexico seeing my family. So yeah, there's like an interesting dynamic there, but that's a
Yeah.
little bit about me growing up.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. Um, I know I didn't send this to you in the questions, but I'm just
Yeah.
curious because it's so true how it and I've seen it in friendships and families here too. The the more distant you are generation wise to that experience of immigration, the more different it looks. Like a lot of loss, I think. And I don't want to say
Mhm.
necessarily culture, but in some ways, like language, I feel is one of the first ones that like goes away. And as you said, and it is evident, I think, from
Mhm.
what you're sharing in your family, but also what I've seen also in my experience here of that loss. But you having though that bicultural experience we have had, and we've actually asked this to some of our other second generation guests, and everyone has had also a different experience of what
Mhm.
being bicultural meant. For some, it was like, no, it was, I didn't feel the distinction, but for others, it was like, I had two worlds. How is it for you? Like,
Mhm.
did you feel that at school, at church? Like, can you tell us a little bit more of that part of
Oh,
of
yeah.
how it was
For sure.
growing up bicultural.
Yeah, so, in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. So when you
Mhm,
think of the city, it's very diverse, although segregated, but lots
mhm,
of international people. But outside of Chicago is the suburbs, and at least when I was growing up there, it was very, white predominant.
mhm,
upper class type of living. And so my dad, having grown up in the inner city of Chicago on the South Side, he wanted to give his family a different experience, a little more, a better education, better school districts. He wanted to provide a different life. So, but he didn't consider what that would do to us growing up culturally. And
Mm.
he didn't have that mentality because he had been raised by his parents purely survival, right? They were just
Mm.
surviving, they
Yeah.
were trying to make do. So then as he got older and when he became a parent, he wanted to provide a whole different type of lifestyle for his kids.
Mm.
And now, like in hindsight, I see that. But when I was growing up, I felt definitely very much like the other. Um,
Mm.
I was one of, I don't know, like 5 minorities in the school district that I was at. And I always felt different, but I didn't know
Yeah.
why or how. And I
Mm.
know some people had experiences of like, well, I was the only one with brown hair and everyone was blonder or the skin. And I don't know. I never necessarily noticed that, but
Yeah.
it was like I felt different because, and as I got older, I noticed like I would go off to Mexico in the summer to see my
Mm.
family and we'd be
Yeah.
speaking all Spanish, right?
Mm.
And then I'd come back and be thrown back into school in a very totally different culture, totally different experience. And there were like my sister and I joke, we were like, do you remember when we'd come back from Mexico and we would had forgotten English words? Like we would remember things on how to say like lollipop, simple basic words we would forget because
Yeah. Yeah.
our mind had, our brain had to switch,
Of
it
course.
was like
Of course. Yeah.
extreme code switching. so
Yes.
so I had definitely that experience where I was like, oh, okay, not everyone left the
Mm.
country to see their family in the summers. And
Yeah.
they were, with their friends, hanging out in the neighborhood and going to summer camps and stuff. That wasn't my experience. But then also, like within our family, like I mentioned, like I had cousins who were a generation removed
Mm.
from, our immigrant story. And they were more embedded in that type of environment and in that culture where they didn't speak the language. And there was friction where they wouldn't understand certain things that I would refer to because, I was
Yeah.
talking to my cousins in Mexico, but then my cousins here didn't understand. So,
Mm.
um, yeah, there's definite like, man, like where do I fit? Like even within my own family, I'm not exactly sure where I fit. I
Yeah.
don't fit with my cousins that live in Mexico 100% of the time. And then I felt like I didn't exactly fit in with my cousins and family that lived here in the US 100% of the time. So there's definitely that back and forth of living biculturally. But there was um, a richness. Like I felt like there was
Mm.
this molding within me of building a different worldview, of a wider worldview. And we can get into this later, like how it
Yeah.
informs how I mother my children, but just
Yeah.
what that looks like to form a wide compassion and understanding for different people's experiences and what that looks like at a young age, not
Yeah.
necessarily as an adult, but as a kid for sure.
Yeah. Wow. That's great. Thank you for sharing. I can definitely see there is this struggle of like, especially at a young age, and when you're a teenager, wanting to fit in and having all these parts that are also very tangibly different. Like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, I get to travel internationally to go see my family who speak a different language. So
Yeah.
and with that comes also cultural things and things like within conversations that is like, well, I can't relate to that, or I don't know what you
Mhm.
mean, that make it difficult to explain to others. But at the same time, I agree
Yeah.
with you, like the richness too, and the gift of the cultural things that we are all so proud of when we talk about our our countries of origin or like our
Uh-huh.
heritage. So I love that you shared all of that.
Oh, for
As
sure.
we know, yeah. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was gonna share that, like, even when I would, like, stay in town, we
Mhm.
actually would attend an immigrant church. Like, the church that I went to with my mom,
Oh wow. Yeah. Yeah.
was a predominantly immigrant church, so even, like, within our suburb, there was like these, I don't want to say divides, but like pockets,
Mhm.
different
Yeah, pockets, yeah.
communities that I was like bouncing in and around. And and then we can get into like the faith aspect stuff too, but just then how
Absolutely,
that
yes.
like informed my faith also as a
Mhm.
daughter of an immigrant, and like what did that look like living in a predominantly white suburb, um just feeling entirely like isolated, but then also surrounded by community. I don't know if that makes
It's
sense,
like,
but
no, hey, 2 things can be true at once.
yeah,
That's the
exactly.
complexity of our stories as well. It's like it's
Yeah.
not either or, and I think a lot of times, especially society, I don't know, culture, we want to reduce that, and it's like, "Oh, it's just like this, and this is what it looked like." It's like, no, it's like, it
Mhm.
looked like this and like this."
Yeah.
Like those both things that made it, like,
Mhm.
richer, and yeah. So, no, that's wonderful. It can be
Yes. They
2
could
things at
both
once.
exist.
It can be both. Both can coexist. So as we talk about immigration and every story being different, there are always hard parts and,
Mhm.
complexities that come with as a second generation, with having a parent who immigrated. And there are also things that were good as well that came from like that sacrifice that your
Yeah.
parents made, right? So
Mhm.
could you share, let's start with what are some of the things that were hardships or difficulties that you had to face because of immigration, or how did that impact how,
Yeah.
like, your childhood, teen years, adult years? Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, so when I was, around 8 or 9 years old,
Mm.
my parents divorced. So, my we talk about, like, going back and forth between
Mhm.
worlds, it got even wider, the gap.
Oh, yeah.
So, my familial experience with my dad and then my experience with my mom just became very, like, I could see the difference a lot more. So, I'll speak more into, like, the experience I had on my mom's side because I lived mainly with her when I
Yeah,
was
for
young.
sure.
So, yeah, when seeing my mom struggle, right? Like
Yeah.
she immigrated, she came, she had children, she started a family, but then that marriage separated and
Mm.
she was left to figure out and navigate this world on her own,
Mm.
essentially.
Yeah.
And barely knowing the language. My mom, um, she didn't finish school, so she didn't have a high school degree. So, while she was like raising my sister and I, her two daughters, she was also trying to finish school, get her GED, and
Wow.
then also trying to find work, right? Like put food on the
Yeah.
table and find a way to provide for us. But man, not just provide, I guess, but she wanted us to thrive. Like she didn't
Mm.
want us just to survive. She wanted us to thrive, to flourish, to grow,
Yeah.
and to live a very different life than the one that she was experiencing. Although I find her experience to be incredible and immensely
Mm.
fruitful as I see like what God was doing through in her story and then like through our family. But yeah, she seeing your parents struggle in that way,
Mm.
and I know this
Yep.
is somewhat of a common experience because as I like share within our immigrant child of immigrant community, there are
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
overlap
Yes.
of needing to like translate for your parent, right? Like going to um school parent teacher conferences and having to be the one translating for your parent, or getting notes sent home from school and you're translating for them and
Yeah.
essentially like guiding your mom through your child, like how to parent you and
Mm.
and how to guide you. It's like this
Yeah.
weird dynamic of I think I've heard it described of like parenting your parent, right?
Yeah.
And because you just had to, like you needed,
Yeah.
there's something inside of me that said, in order for me to do well, I have to take care of my mom and I have to make sure that she is as well informed as she can be so that she can take care of me. And
Yeah.
that is a lot of responsibility for a child. That
That
is,
is, yeah.
you're thinking way more above and beyond than, you know, what you should be as a kid, like,
Mhm.
oh, my friends, my favorite toy. What am I going to do this afternoon?
Yeah.
But then you have that, like, for me, it was like I had my childhood, the
Yeah.
things that I just as a 9, 10-year-old little girl loved and adored and dreamed and wanted to do. But then I had the realities of my circumstance with my mom
Mm.
and the limitations that we had. So that awareness was definitely like that survival mindset that is imposed on you. Definitely would consider that a hardship because it's still something I'm trying to get over as an adult now. And then also like find the benefits of it, of what I learned from that. But then at the same time, what were the downfalls of that? Like, what are the things
Mm.
that I'm carrying with me that I don't that I need to let go? That as the survival mindset buckles down a little bit. Like, what do I
Yeah.
want to hold on to and what do I need to let go? So, and part of that was like my future, like carving my path. Like, my mom didn't go to college. And so when it came that time, like my older sister was, she's, God bless her. She was the older sister, the guinea pig, like trying to do things differently
Yeah.
and um, carving her path. But then also I would realize like her path isn't mine also. So
Mhm.
what did it look like for me to step into adulthood and figure out my life as well? And so yeah, so there are things that like these memories that I have growing up of kind of parenting and guiding my mom. Like, oh man, Marlene, for example, like when my mom was she was studying for her citizenship test
Yeah.
because she
Mhm.
wasn't a citizen.
Yeah.
So she was going through all these things when I was like in middle school. And I remember, at least in Chicago, we would have
Yeah.
like, you would have to take your citizenship test, or like not your citizenship test, but you would have to test about like the Declaration of Independence, like all these basic like United States history, and you had to take
Mm.
this big test. And my
Wow.
mom
Yeah.
and I were studying together all that history. And I just remember thinking like, I don't think this is normal. Like this can't
Yeah.
be, I
No,
don't think
for
this is
sure.
every
Yeah.
kid's
It's like,
experience, you know?
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
those
No, thank you
things
for
like the
sharing. Yeah.
overlap of parenting and being a child for sure.
Yeah. And that is one of the places and experiences I've always admired, even as an immigrant myself, because I immigrated here as an adult. So when I
Mm,
hear my friends who are second generation share things like, I had to be a parent basically, I'm like, man, that's hard. I
yeah.
didn't have to experience that.
Mhm.
I was in a different country. My parents, like, I was able to still be a child in a way,
Mhm.
where you you guys have had to grow up a lot, like, you're translating documents, like legal documents, bills, things that until I was an adult, I'm like, oh, now I have to deal with this. I guess I have to learn how to do this. Yeah, but you were placed in a different situation where it was like,
Mhm.
oh no, actually, I'm the one that has to, kind of represent. So, and it's a lot of pressure
Mhm.
for a young person, to have to carry
Yes.
that and the struggle. So, thank you
For
for
sure.
sharing that. I truly honor that, and honor that experience because it is not an easy thing,
Mhm.
when you're growing up and then going through also normal teenage kid stuff as well,
Yeah.
like regular struggles, but that also look and that I'm sure that had shaped also even how those felt and how it looked like tangibly.
Yeah.
Um, so what are some things too that you would say maybe you have also seen like it's that you're thankful for as you think about how immigration and the things that are also
Mm.
um good, like the opportunities that you have now because of the decision your mom made to move here.
Mhm.
What do you
Okay,
think
like
are some of those?
totally being honest.
Yeah,
Yeah. Just to be completely frank with you, this question was
yeah.
really hard for me. It was
Mm,
really hard because I I was like, how I'm thankful that my parents
mm,
immigrated, but it's like the hardship, the struggle, like all those things, you
yeah,
wish that you didn't have to go through that. Like you wish that
yeah.
that wasn't a common experience. Um,
Mm,
so when you asked like, what are you thankful for about your parents immigrating? I mean, yeah, I could go to the whole like
Yeah.
being in the US and our freedoms and all, like, I feel like that, that's why they came, for we can say a different life, a different
Yeah.
way of being, but um there are days where I do struggle. There are times where I'm like, man, like this was hard, and why
Mhm.
did my why I think depending also on the circumstances on why your parents immigrate or why
Yeah.
people immigrate anyway, it can be hard to think of that as something to be thankful for that you had to do,
Mm.
because it's it can be a very traumatic experience. Um,
Yeah.
but like as I think about it and as I start to grow like more compassion for myself and for my parents and their experience,
Yeah.
that's where I start to see, I'm like, you know what? That is what I am thankful for, is that this experience
Mm.
has like expanded my heart and my
Yeah.
mind for different people's different life experiences, right?
Mm.
And
Yeah.
at a very deep level, I talked about compassion earlier. Like someone could share a bit of their story to me, and I may have like no context. I may not relate at all. But just the fact that I know what it feels like to be a person where I felt like no one understood me, or that I felt like my story was so different. And because of that, I was being judged for it, or I was being viewed in a negative light for reasons outside of my control.
Yeah.
It really made me see people, for who they are and like how God has made them uniquely, and to just hold their story sacred. Like, this is who you are. This is how God has made you. And that is why I find myself being thankful for what my family experienced when in their immigration story. Um, and then also, I've noticed, the privilege that comes with the sacrifices that they have made. And I think
Yeah.
that's something, at least for me, it was hard to say I have privilege, because growing up, I was like, well, we went through so much, we sacrificed a lot. My parents
Yeah.
sacrificed, and we went through a life of scarcity. My mom being a single mom, there are days or multiple days where we would have to um, go to food banks, because we just
Mm.
didn't have
Mm.
enough, or we would be eating. My mom would make like a giant, to this day we joke about it, but she would make this giant pot of caldo, like vegetable soup.
Yeah.
And she would make the big pot, and she would throw all the vegetables in and make this caldo. And the big pot meant like this is what we were eating for
Mm.
days and possibly weeks if we could extend it. But I just remember thinking like, oh, the pot's coming out. We're gonna have caldo again. Like, oh man, I know what's
You
coming. Like,
already
I don't
knew
want to
what's
eat that.
coming. Yeah.
Yes, I knew it was coming. I was like, oh, and I was a kid, and I'd see my mom bring that pot out, and I was like, oh, my mommy otra vez. Like, I don't want to eat that for the next couple weeks. And
Yeah.
she just being so graceful, like she gave me so much love. I just
Mm.
roll her eyes and be like, you'll be fine. It's fine. You're gonna eat it anyway. But
Yeah.
now, like as an adult, I see what my mom did. Like, she would save her money to buy
Mm.
produce, because that was the most expensive thing, to buy fresh
Yeah.
ingredients. And she would just throw it all in a pot and try and extend it. She's like, "What's the best way that I can feed my kids? And what's the cheapest like way to make this go as far as I can?" And
Yeah.
I didn't realize that that was like that was her survival. Like, that was her trying to take care of us in the best way, in the only way that she knew. But now, like, I
Mm.
have the privilege to not eat caldo if I don't
Yeah.
want,
Yeah, for sure. Yes. I mean,
so
that's
it's,
real. It's real.
yeah,
Yeah.
it is. And so, like, and even to this day, like, I know, like, and caldo's like a huge, within the Mexican culture, like, that's
Yeah.
what we eat. But I still struggle
Yeah.
with that sometimes. I'm like, well, I don't have to eat it. Like, why am I going to eat
Yeah.
it?
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that is a privilege that I now have. And that's because my parents sacrificed. And that's what they've done in order to give me that choice, right? To give me that privilege of deciding what it is that I want to, what I want to do, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that answer
No.
your question?
Yes, that answers that. No, and thank you for being brutally honest,
Yeah.
because that's what we want here. It is hard, and that's the reality of like the struggle. And one of the things that I actually
Mhm.
it also challenges me, like when I'm like, okay, why am I grateful? I mean, there's a lot of hardships that comes with this. But what I've
Yeah.
loved to hear from all of our guests is to see but Jesus, but God in our
Mhm.
stories, in
Mhm.
spite of these injustices, in spite of all these things that aren't supposed to be this way, right? Because we live in a
Yes.
broken world. And yet,
Mhm.
there is a thing that, especially in the Latino community, I've seen, not only from my own story, but like hearing your stories, but the faith and the gratitude that also comes out of these, hard places and
Mhm.
places that are looked down on, that people consider like lowly or unworthy. And yet
Mhm.
the richness of faith and strength and resilience that there is, and there are people have had to really survive a lot of times, um
Mhm.
gone into places that are really just difficult. So this is a perfect segue into you sharing more about that faith aspect. How have you seen God within your story? Like,
Mm.
and all, yeah. Interpret that and answer it in the way that you want. But yeah,
Yeah.
would love to hear more about your faith and how the Lord has impacted that.
Oh man, yeah. No, it's he's absolutely impacted my entire life. Seeing having seen my mom's experience and then just like growing up with her and what it looks like to be raised by an immigrant, you develop this deep understanding and appreciation for stories of migration in the Bible. There's like
Yes.
it develops this context for how I view the word and
Mm,
how the Lord speaks to us through his living word, and like stories of Abraham and Ruth and Naomi and immigration. Like people have always been on the move, right? Like people have always been moving, and the Lord has always been working through that, through those stories. Um, and just the
yeah.
resilience that it builds throughout those generations. I've gotten to see that firsthand in my family.
Mm,
Um, when my mom was, yeah, so I did not grow up in a non-denominational or Christian household. I grew up
mm,
Roman Catholic, but it was more like a cultural Catholicism.
yeah.
It was more
Yeah.
like we go to church on Easter,
Yep.
Christmas, do the communion, things like that. But there was never really a discussion or an emphasis on that personal relationship with the Lord. Um, but as a kid, I had always understood like the importance of prayer and
Mm,
a reliance on the Lord because of my experience in this immigrant church that my mom would take us to, and how people would just give what they had in order to show their love and worship to God. And
mm,
at times I didn't understand. I was like, how, if you don't have much, how can you give? Like, how can you just keep on giving if you don't have a lot to begin with? And so I would see my neighbors, like my not necessarily my neighbors. How do I say like this hermanas and hermanos in church, like
yeah,
our
yeah,
fellow
yeah, part
congregants.
of your
Like,
community,
sorry, I'm
yeah,
like, how
yeah,
do I
yeah.
translate this?
Yeah.
But um, like think in Spanish and English. I'm like, sometimes it
Girl,
doesn't
I
work
get
out.
it, yeah.
But yeah, so I would see how they are sisters and brothers in church and how they would give,
Mm,
and would give with so much just sacrifice and love and without
mm,
expecting anything in return. And that just always showed me like there are multiple ways to show worship and love to the Lord, and it's by
yes.
giving what it is that you can. And it's not necessarily always financial,
Mhm,
but
true.
and how you serve and love other people.
Mhm,
And so yeah, there in my faith and seeing that with my mom and in the immigrant church that we would grow up in, I definitely saw the Lord in how he spoke to, to me as a little girl. Um, sorry, there's another thing I wanted to say. Oh, and so just like as a second generation
yeah.
Mexican American, we can get comfortable, like we can think, like I've talked about that privilege. Like my parents worked hard in order for us to live a certain lifestyle now. And
Mm,
then, but as I got older, I'm like, well, if I don't have these like survival things reminding me to lean on the Lord, what does it look like when I'm comfortable, when things are going well, when things aren't difficult?
Ooh,
How do I lean
yes.
on the Lord, right? Like I
Yep.
have food on my table. I have
Mhm.
clothes on my back, but
Mhm.
what does it look like to still remain faithful and
Mm.
to hold a healthy fear of the Lord when things are going well? And so I remember that, that everything is temporary, nothing is permanent.
Yeah.
That, there we're always, I think someone once said that you're either leaving a storm, you're in a storm, or you just got out of one. And what that looks like in your life to lean on God throughout all of that.
Wow,
And
yeah.
seeing the immigration story within my family has definitely made that something that I can hold on to, of like, okay, you know what? Things are good. And not to live out of fear that, things are gonna go bad at any point in
Yeah,
time,
for sure, for sure.
but that it's just a part of life that, things aren't
Yeah.
always gonna go the way that we plan and the way that we expect them to, but it's important to keep God at the center. And so as I grew up, my mom came to the Lord when I was around, like, I don't know, a teenager in high school.
Okay.
That's when she finally, like, I I don't want to, like, speak into her testimony because that's her
For
story
sure,
and
yeah.
she's
Yeah.
amazing, but the God met her where she was at, and she had to get to a point where
Mm.
she was really, really low. Um,
Yeah.
but then when that happened, when she met the Lord and fell in love and realized what it was to have this amazing personal relationship with him, she then
Mm.
obviously wanted to come to her children, to me and her
For
as her
sure, yeah.
daughter, and evangelize to me and proclaim the good word. And to be honest, like, I didn't want to have anything to do with it.
Mm.
I didn't want to hear it, because I was like, we have
Yeah.
been through so much. And even though I always felt a belief and a faith in God,
Mhm.
did struggle with, like, well, is he even really there sometimes? Like, when you're
Yeah.
young,
Mm.
when I was young, I was like very rebellious and bold, and definitely still was on my mind.
Yeah.
And so I told my mom, I was like, Mom, I don't want anything to do with your God. Like, if this is what,
Mm.
comes of that, like, that is something that I don't necessarily want to be a part of. And as a
Mm.
mom now, I'm like, "Oh my gosh, that must have been so hard for her to hear. Must have broke
Yeah.
her heart." Um,
Yeah.
but it really was where I was coming from. Like, that's just the point that I had been at as a teenager after having witnessed everything that my family had gone through. Um,
Yeah.
but the Lord is creative. He is relentless in his pursuit of his children. And
Oh,
I
he
thank
is.
God.
That he
Yes.
is.
I thank God that he is. I'm so grateful that
Yeah.
that is his character and that is who he is, because
Mm.
he would not let go. He would
Mm.
not let go of, he wouldn't let me be too stubborn. It got me to a
Mm.
point. I wasn't listening to my mom, obviously. She would try to, tell me about the gospel and everything, and I just didn't want to hear from her. And so when we talk about, the Lord, Jesus going for the leaving the 99 and pursuing that one, I was definitely had that season where he was relentlessly pursuing me, and he was like, "You
Mm.
know what? If I can't get through to you through your mom and your family, um, it was through complete strangers that he definitely brought me closer to him." I would be
Wow.
in, like, a coffee shop
Yeah.
and just minding my own business, waiting in line, and someone just tap me on my shoulder and say, "Hey, I have a word from you from the Lord." What? We're in Starbucks? You have a what for me?
What is happening right now?
I know. I
A
was like, what
stranger?
is going Yeah, I was like, I don't know
Yeah.
you. Like, I was in Chicago at the time. I had moved
Yeah.
out of my
Yeah.
house and everything. And I was just like, hey, stranger. And they would just start, sharing
Mm.
what the Lord put on their heart. And it was as simple as, God loves you, he adores you. And then other times it was a direct verse from the word. And it would every single time leave me, in awe of, like, wait a minute. And with each one, God was breaking down my heart a little at a
Softening.
time. Yeah, not
Yeah.
breaking down, softening my heart. I was like
Yeah.
hard. I had a hard heart. So maybe he was breaking it
Mhm.
down. But
Yep. Yeah.
he was definitely, speaking through just complete strangers. And that's why I always like to share that with people sometimes, because we can struggle with, like, sharing the word with complete strangers and like, oh, God put something on my heart, but I don't know if I'm going to go say it. It might be a little come off as weird.
Yeah.
But man, you know what? Those are the seeds that God plants, and he
Wow.
really does. If you're just obedient with the little, with the few, he will take it and just yeah, you'll see the fruit of it. Or even if you don't see the fruit of it, it will happen.
Yeah.
It will be there.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that's just how I've seen God in my story and in my family story, just realizing that leaning on the Lord isn't always necessarily something you have to do because you have no other option or because things are so difficult, but
Yep.
it's a privilege. It's a joy. It's something that I can't imagine, now living without. Um it's oxygen, it's air. So yeah, that's just something that God has put on my heart as I look back on all of that.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's
I kind of feel like I
incredible.
went on a tangent, but
I
there was
love no,
something in there.
no. That was exactly what we needed to hear, and what a testimony. I mean, that's just beautiful. I love it. I love that the Lord spoke to you in the ways that he knew he could get to you, to your
Mhm.
heart. And now you're here. And I can't imagine how um that has impacted even now as we go into the next part of like what has that looked like in your family, and how do you keep it
Yeah.
intentional with that, and how does culture come with faith and culture come in and collide together. But yeah, even there's something, a couple things that you mentioned, like what there's a difference between, and this is something I personally had to also like work through, having a faith that I'm like, I depend on the Lord because I need him. I'm surviving out here, especially when
Mhm.
I lived in Honduras, having that specific experience, and then coming here, I'm like, well, I have a privilege. I have privilege now,
Yeah.
I don't quote unquote like need like for my basic needs. I
Yeah.
don't need to wait and ask for, to give me money for rent at the end of the month. I have all these things, and if I also have more than enough,
Yes. Yes.
so there is has come a thing of like rediscovering a faith that is not tied onto just the surviving
Mhm.
piece, but it's like we
Yeah.
need God, not just for him to provide for these things that we need, that are basic needs, but that go beyond like that need to penetrate every part of our hearts,
Yeah.
so I love that he did that for you, and that
Mhm.
he is continuing to do that in us. um so tell us a little bit about more your family. How does that look like with your kids now, because they're considered third generation, right?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
yes,
And
yes. So
4th on my dad's side. Yeah.
okay, third and fourth. So you
Yeah.
have that, how has that looked like, parenting with like all the good, the hard, the beautiful,
Yeah.
yeah, all the things that come with your story, and how like the things
Yeah.
that as we've talked to here on the podcast as well, like that you had to like you broke down and now are creating new even traditions and new things.
Mhm.
So what has that looked like for you guys?
Oh my gosh, yeah. That has been probably the greatest experiment, like parenting as, a 2nd, 3rd generation Mexican American. Yeah, it is.
Mm,
It feels like an experiment of like what works, what doesn't work. But I
yeah.
will say that as soon as I found out, I was gonna be a mom. As soon as I found out I was pregnant with my oldest daughter, it was definitely something that God put on my heart of like, okay, what is this formation of your family going to look like? And
Yeah.
and I think it was because we moved from a scarcity type of survival
Yep.
experience to one of abundance,
Mm,
and also worrying about what that would mean for my children and in connection to their culture also of like now they're a whole nother generation removed. And
yep.
to be completely honest, the older I got, English became my predominant language. Like it
Yeah.
Spanish, I'm still bilingual, but it's not my language of comfort. Well,
Mm,
no. Well, I'm not as comfortable speaking in Spanish the way that I am now in English, But I will say Spanish is like my heart language. Like worshiping in Spanish still brings me to tears every single time. And it does feel like a heart language. So
Yeah.
comfort in a different way.
Makes
But
sense. Makes
anyway,
sense. Makes
so
sense.
I was, yeah. So I was like, man, but if I raise my kids, like my daughter, from the very beginning speaking mainly English, like where is she going to get her Spanish from? And like, how is she
Yeah.
going to learn? And my in-laws, my husband's parents, they're immigrants as well from Mexico, and they are predominantly Spanish speakers. Their English,
Yeah.
is not strong to the point where they would be able to communicate and connect in that way with their
For sure.
grandchildren. And
Yeah.
so I definitely had this worry. I was like, I need to protect aspects of our culture and this
Yeah.
unique identity and experience for my kids. And I don't know what it was, Marlene, to be honest. I really think it was just like a divine intervention of like, what is
Yeah.
this going to look like? And I had to move forward on what that is. And so,
Mm.
um, I was a stay-at-home mom, so I was like, all right, you know what? It's going to be Spanish at home. I felt like I was going back to my mom of like
Yeah.
Spanish en la casa, español en
Yeah.
la
Yeah.
casa.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
like, as soon as you come home or when we're home, it's all Spanish. And so it worked fine until my girls, and I had another daughter, my girls
Mhm.
got to about like school age
Yeah.
and started kindergarten. And thankfully we've have like way more education and knowledge on what it means to be a bilingual child, and how our kids have spongy brains and can learn multiple
Yeah.
languages without
Yeah.
worrying about how their education is going to be impacted. So my daughter started kindergarten and being a predominantly entirely Spanish speaker,
Yeah.
learned English in school. And a part of me was like, I did it. I was fine. So she'll be okay. So
Yeah.
we did that. But yeah, and then she started speaking mainly English at home or English at school. And then when we come home, it was a struggle. Like it was an adjustment of having to make sure that to protect that language in our home. Of like, once you
Yeah.
come in through our door, we're like, this is a magic door frame. Once you enter this
You have
door,
entered.
it's Spanish.
It's Spanish. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I love that.
Todo en
I love
español.
that.
So
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
so for kids, like, for my girls, I had to, give them that kind of those parameters. And so that was one thing. I really wanted them to have the language. I felt like that was important
Yeah.
to communicate with their family
For
and
sure.
to have that linguistic tie to their culture. Because we didn't, we weren't going to Mexico as often as we were when I was young.
Yeah. For sure.
So I wanted them to have that aspect. And then
Mm.
even more, it was like the type of books that we have at home, the people that the characters that are in the books that they read. I wanted to make sure that they saw themselves in that literature. I've worked in publishing and writing, and like I said, stories are so important to me. We see ourselves in them, and when we
Yeah.
don't, we take notice that our similarities or our experiences missing. And because I had such a hard time as a kid, finding those pieces of me and putting them together and finding this example or this cohesive story that I could kind of follow, I really wanted to create that for my children. And
Yeah.
we've come a long way. There's still lots of work to do, but we've come a
Yeah.
long way in like specifically children's books and that and the BIPOC experience,
Yeah.
how different it is even within those communities and having
Oh yeah.
representation
For sure.
for that. So for me, it was books and literature and making sure that my kids were exposed to
Mhm.
people that looked like them, people that didn't look like them, and then building that compassion from the beginning of
Yeah.
that people are different and will have different experiences, but that doesn't make it any better or worse. And so, for
Mm.
example, like, the words that we use in our home, we're very intentional about the words that we use. So when
Yeah.
we talk about different cultures or different language or people's even different experiences,
Mhm.
my daughters at first would say, "Oh, that's weird. That's strange," and I was like, no, like the words that we use have power And
Mm.
the what they say, like the words that come out through your heart, like reflect your
Yep.
heart,
Yep. Yep.
right? And so I was like, it's not weird. So let's talk about
Mm.
what is it that's making you think that way. It's different. You maybe haven't
Yeah.
experienced that before. So let's dive into that. Is it making you uncomfortable? Why? So that builds compassion in kids, like
Ooh.
asking them and diving into those like difficult conversations, because I experienced that. I was,
Yeah.
a product of people thinking I was weird or my culture was weird. Like my
Mm.
experience was different.
And
So,
othered.
and
Yes.
othered, yeah. And I was like, we need
Mm.
to make sure that we're not carrying over these hurtful narratives and habits
Mm.
that we just fall into without thinking. Um,
Yeah.
but it takes a lot of intention. It takes a lot of effort,
Yep.
but it's just kind of like the way that I want to honor my family's experience through my children and having that influence in the next generation for my kids. So, and it's also like as simple as making sure we're eating, Mexican
Yeah.
food, like good
Yeah.
Mexican
Yeah.
food.
Yeah.
I might get some like backlash on this, but when we moved to Texas, I didn't know how like predominant Tex-Mex food is here. So we went from
Yeah.
Chicago, which has a
Yeah.
very large Mexican immigrant population,
Yeah.
moved to Texas, and I was like, "Oh, awesome! We're closer to Mexico. We're gonna have
Yeah, you are. Yeah. Yeah.
awesome Mexican food
Yeah. Yeah.
everywhere." And
Uh-huh.
it was Tex-Mex, and it's very
Mm.
different. Like
Very
I
different.
can
Yes, it's not.
very
Yeah. Yeah.
different.
Yeah. Very
So
different
there
for
are
sure.
like
Yeah.
slight similarities, but it is I think it's an
Yeah. Oh,
entirely
yeah.
different type of
I agree
cuisine.
with you.
So
I agree. I agree
and
with
so
you.
I was
I agree
like,
with you.
yeah. So I was like, where are we need Mexican food and good Mexican food. Like, where are we gonna go?
Authentic.
And
Yeah.
then making authentic Mexican food. So putting that effort in, like, okay, this is different, and
Mm.
this is where our family is rooted from, and this is the food
Yeah.
that we grew up eating. And then also just making it at home, doing those traditions of the food at home, and also like the holidays. So I grew up celebrating Three Kings, de los
Yeah.
Tres Reyes
Mhm.
Magos, and to me, that, like, as a kid, that was Christmas. Like that was
Mm.
like the big celebration. Like we would go to Mexico to celebrate Three Kings, and instead of sitting on
Yeah.
Santa's lap and asking him for things for gifts, we would go see the Three Kings
Yeah, the Three Kings. Yep.
and ask for, or three wise men, and ask, it's like literally translated Three Kings, but it's like the three
Mhm.
wise men.
Yep.
So, that I was like, "Oh, I really like that tradition and that story," because it's so rooted biblically. Like, it
Yeah.
brings it back to the word and Jesus
Mm.
experience and that immigrant story, and I'm like, they
Yeah.
traveled to find him. Like,
They did.
we
Yep.
obviously know Jesus was, like, not home,
Mm.
so
Oh, for sure. Yep.
he
Yep.
was
Yep.
far. So things like that of like, okay, we celebrate Three Kings with my kids in our home, and we do the rosca. We put our shoes out with the like hay or grass for the animals to eat, and just being intentional of those
Mm.
traditions that we want to keep
Yeah.
going in our family, and creating those memories and those ties. And honestly, Marlene, it takes a lot of work and a lot of
Yep.
intention, but my kids are now, like 9 and 7. My girls are 9, 7, and our
Okay.
youngest boy, he's 2. But especially with my girls, I'm starting to see like the fruit of all the work that we did when
Wow.
they were younger,
Yeah.
because we took them to Mexico for the first time a couple months
Mhm.
ago. And because of COVID, it took so long to get them there. We were
For sure.
hoping to
Yeah.
go years ago, but
Mm.
finally we were able to take them yeah, it was a couple months ago. And it was like the culmination of everything that they've learned and experienced growing up, because when we were there, they were finally able to see it there in the homeland in a
Mm.
way. Like, speak they were able to navigate and understand and meet their family that they hadn't met, and talk to them and share certain experiences, but also have their own story to share of like what's different for them. And
Yeah.
it was so cool to see it come together when we were in Mexico together. And my husband and I were like, wow, we need to do this way more often. Like, we need to go to
Yeah.
Mexico with the kids
Absolutely.
a lot more.
Yeah.
But it was so cool to see it all come together in that trip for sure.
That is absolutely beautiful. I'm just listening here and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, okay, put this in the back of your pocket whenever we do have kids with my husband, because
Mhm.
we have talked, like, extensively, and we don't even have them yet, but
No,
about
that's
the
good.
importance of being intentional, and hearing you say
Yeah.
that because, I'm like, "Yeah, my parents don't speak English, so we're gonna need to be super intentional in teaching them Spanish, and we are gonna have a very marked, like,
Yeah.
difference culturally, so, how that's gonna be for them and
Mhm.
navigate, but I love, especially, I think what stood out, it's, that I think I wanna commend you also, just, like, how beautiful and how intentional you're being in teaching them, that different can mean, like, can be a good thing too, like, hey, it's
Yeah.
not, because I think it's just innate, I think, in human nature to see something different than ourselves and for fear to happen, or for there to be this, like,
Mhm.
disconnect, or yeah, just the othering,
Mhm.
it's very common, but
Discomfort.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
So I am so glad that, you're seeing the fruit of that. And I can imagine, whenever they become teenagers, the experience is gonna evolve and change. But man, how beautiful it is to hear that you're seeing the fruit of that, and that they are growing up with compassion
Mm.
and awareness of people that are different, and to even teach that cultural intelligence, especially in a place like the
Yeah.
US. It's so needed because you have people
Yeah.
from all over the world. So learning to, you know, approach one another and love
Mhm.
one another and meet where we're at and learn and lean in to those differences. And I think that that's why we've
Mhm.
also enjoyed, I've learned through so much, even through, like, all the different experiences and all the people from all different countries. Like, there are similarities, but so many things that are different too.
Yeah.
So just even, celebrating those differences, not, excluding it and making it seem like, oh, well, um, what is, like, our nature and our first response to really say, hey, no, let's talk about it. Let's dig in. Why did it feel different or weird? So that's beautiful. Thank
For
you so
sure.
much. Thank you for sharing your story. This has been so rich,
Yes.
so, oh my gosh, so incredible. As we
Mm.
close out this conversation, we always ask our guests, um, as we continue to honor and love on. I mean, it's the Love Will podcast,
Yes.
and we're all continuing to learn how to love people, because that's one of the hardest things, right? To love ourselves and
Yeah.
love others. It's something that we need to learn on a daily basis. So,
Mhm.
given you have shared your story and your experience of a second generation um, Mexican American, how
Mhm.
would you say we can love you all well? Love you and your experience and people with your similar story. How can, if we come across, or we meet someone like you with your experience, how can we love you all well?
Arlen, I think I lost you.
Oh, there we go. Okay, can you hear me now?
There you are.
Little technical
I was like,
difficulty.
"It's okay."
So, I don't know if you were able to catch my question, but I can repeat it if not.
Yeah, a little bit, but if you could repeat it, that'd be great.
Yes, like, how can we love second generation
Mm.
um immigrants? Like, how can we love you all better?
Mhm.
Um yes.
Yeah, great question. So as Christians, just how we do anything well, we look to the Bible and
Mhm.
how it informs us
Yeah.
and how it influences our heart and our mind. And I say specifically mind because there's so much information out there about the immigrant experience and
Mhm.
what is and isn't going on and what is happening specifically in our
Mhm.
country.
Yep.
So I think it's important that when we look at this issue biblically, we let it penetrate our hearts and our minds, like what we
Mm.
think and how we rationalize and think through those issues.
Yeah.
Um, for me now, as a second generation, like I am huge about advocating and a and almost like reminding our community, like, where we come from, that we cannot forget,
Mm, yeah.
our experiences and how we show up for one another and for people who are different, but we may have a similar experience. And so specifically for immigrants on how to love them well, because I wanna say immigrants because loving them well is loving their children also and their families.
Hey,
So, first of
say that
all,
again.
you look for
Yes.
them. Like, they're
Mm,
around you. They're there. So, look for them.
mhm.
They're in your neighborhood, in your
Yeah.
city. They're closer than you think.
Mm,
Look for them. And then once you found them, listen, hear them,
mm,
hear their stories, get to know them. And not just as an educational piece, but as a way to really learn from them. And
yeah.
you will see the world opens up. It really does. The world isn't as big as we think it is. And so
Yeah.
listening to their stories will definitely do that. Third, obviously, I think once you get to know someone is you serve them. You
Mm,
you see how you can what you can do. And I think by serving them, I want to be very specific on serve them in the way that they need, not in the way that you think they need to be served. And that required the step before of listening and hearing what they have to say. And
for
if you
sure.
listen
Yeah.
well, then you will know how to serve them well. And
Mm,
then, of course, pray for them. I think
mm,
once you've gotten to that point and you've and created a relationship and gotten to know their story, you will definitely be led to want to pray for them, just as you would anyone important in your life or any other
for sure.
person that you
Mhm.
value. And I believe that then through all those steps, you will love them. You will love them well.
Mm,
You will know what it means to love them well. And when you love someone well, you will advocate for them. You will do what you can to hopefully improve their situation. You will care about their experience. And specifically for us, the second and third generation, our parents weren't able to advocate for themselves in the way that we can
yeah.
now, not just for them, but for other immigrants and their families. And we
Yeah.
talked about privilege. I talked
Mm.
about
Yeah.
privilege in different ways, but this is a privilege. This is an example of
Yeah.
that we can now
Yeah.
advocate for our communities. We
Yeah.
can hold our representatives and people who influence policies that affect our communities accountable. And
Mm,
that is a privilege that we now have that we can do. Um, I think back to when I was young and I'm like, well, why couldn't someone do something? Or why is this happening? Things like that. And it's important to remember that now we can step into those spaces and advocate well for immigrants. And we will do that well by loving them. So
yeah.
also, I also one last thing I want to give is that
Yeah.
immigration
Absolutely.
is is a global issue. Like it's not
Mm,
something that's only unique to us. And
yeah.
if we learn to love and serve our immigrant neighbors well, we will see that it impacts the world. And
Mm,
it is something that has multiple factors. People move for multiple reasons.
for
And
sure.
it'll just, like I mentioned, open your mind and see the world. I truly believe the way that Jesus does.
Mm. Amen. Thank you for that beautiful invitation. That
Yeah.
was yes, that, it's a challenge that I think we all need to be reminded of as
Hmm.
we encounter, because it's not a matter of if, but when we encounter people
Yeah.
that have different stories, and especially those of displacement or having to leave your home for
Yeah.
many, many different reasons. It's going to the heart of, okay, why did this happen? But I love the advocacy piece that you brought. It's super, super, super important as we talk about
Hmm.
loving well, advocacy, that's the heart of Jesus as well.
Yeah.
And as we are his hands and feet, as believers, that is a big part. We are called to be peacemakers, not peacekeepers, because I think that there's a,
Absolutely.
a different difference sometimes that we lose that in the Christian community. It's like, no, we keep the peace. It's
Hmm.
like, no, we have to make the peace. That requires movement, that
Hmm.
requires
Yes, there's an
involvement
active component to
that
that.
requires getting uncomfortable, you know, all
Yeah.
the things. So
Yep.
thank you. And that's our heartbeat here, to be able to do that through stories, through, you know,
Mhm.
listening to what life look that we got to talk during this beautiful hour, and you've brought us into your world and what that looked like. So thank you so much for sharing with
Yeah.
us so vulnerably. It's been truly an honor to for me to even get to know more of your story, and even say, wow, look at God. Look at God,
Yeah.
and how he has restored, redeemed, healed,
Mhm.
and will continue on as you know, like within your family. So
Yeah.
thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you everyone for listening in. We will catch you in the next episode. Bye
Yeah.
bye.